Hi, and welcome to this Insights. This Insight session, I'm delighted to be joined by Sonia Allison-Penny, who is not only a fantastic HR consultant, but also very much a practitioner of talent management. And that's really the theme of today's topic that I want to explore is talent management. And it's really interesting, the period that we've gone through, because we've seen talent management change dramatically over the last few years. But in particular, over the last 12 months, as we've all lived through a pandemic. And Sonia, what have you seen, again, as a consultant and practitioner, in terms of how talent management is being applied and what's different?
Yeah, it's funny that you mention COVID, Andy. So great to be here as well. Particularly the practitioner bit is the bit I love the most. So it's fun to be talking about what's really happening out there that I can see some themes with. When you mention COVID, I know that this is a very real experience that we're having right now. I know that for some people it is exceptionally real, and I don't want to diminish some of the impacts of it, but my honest view is that COVID is almost like a dry run for what we're going to experience with Industry 4.0. So we have been preparing a little bit for the kind of things we're experiencing now on steroids, volatility, ambiguity, all of those very uncomfortable things that we experienced during COVID. But for me, it's like the lead up to the World Cup, because I'm a rugby fan, that this is like I'm sorry to diminish it, but it's like a friendly. You play a few friendly games, right, to sharpen your skill set. And that's exactly how I see what we're experiencing right now, is that in the years to come, as we have an exponential increase of pace, speed, volatility, ambiguity, lots of uncomfortable things, this can actually be seen as a really fantastic opportunity for what did we get, what did we do well, and what have we not done so well? Because you know what, we're just going to keep experiencing things like this. Not the same as a pandemic, but the skills that we're having to demonstrate during this pandemic, we are going to need more and more and more as Industry 4.0 starts to pick up. So I'm interested what your view is of that.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I've often said that change is the new constant, right? Organizations are going to have to change, but the workforce is going to have to change as well, and it's got to have that foresight and agility when it comes to the change to be able to pivot very quickly in different directions. And as you said, COVID and the pandemic has forced organizations in many respects to really accelerate some of that work and figure it out, such as digitizing the workforce or changing a different strategy in a different direction, and how does that impact the people. And we've seen organizations thrive through that, and we've also seen organizations really struggle through that. And to me, a lot of that is obviously about the leadership, and how the leadership is prepared for it and has the right skills for it. And again, when it comes to the leadership layer, what's happening there?
It's funny because, I've spent years trying to impress upon the tremendous importance of leadership. It has a 70% impact on culture. Culture has up to a 35% impact on profits or revenue success of a company. So, you want to focus a lot of your time on leadership. However, I think one thing that we're seeing now is the concept of distributed leadership. One thing that we're realizing is that if one definition of great leadership is that an individual hires phenomenal people around them and then gets out the way. Their job is actually to remove hurdles from very smart people already. So command and control, if it wasn't already a dying breed before, it certainly isn't a pandemic era. So you can't get your secretary to print off your emails anymore. You have got to pivot. You have got to figure out how to use technology. And so it must have been a horrendous period of time for a whole stack of leaders who just weren't equipped to deal with this degree of digital change. But the savvy ones who were already preparing for Industry 4.0 and digital, the ones that had invested in technology, the ones that had upskilled in terms of employee learning having to speed up, skill sets having to change, creating that more, dreaded word agile that everybody's tired of now. But the reality is that it's really, really important. And you use the word pivot. And I know that that could also be seen as another buzzword, but it's reality. And I'd like to share with you later a couple of examples of where I've seen leaders really succeed and unfortunately really on the path to quite significant failure. We know there are winners and losers in this period of time, But the one thing I'd end this particular piece on is that leadership is shown when you're under pressure. It's not shown when the going's good, right? So easy growth allowed us during that period of time to not necessarily sharpen some of the skills that have become absolutely crucial during the pandemic and will continue to be crucial as we're put under more and more pressure with digital and Industry 4.0.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. And certainly for myself, I mean, from a leader's perspective, this has probably been one of the hardest periods ever to drive an organization, drive a function, and support people, because you're right, it's very different. It's very different on the end of a call like this versus being in a room with individuals. And also we've been hit by lots of other really important topics around diversity within the workforce. How do you cope with different people working in a remote sense? It really has meant leaders have had to adapt to that. And I can see how some leaders, from the outside could be seen as being successful because the business results are probably still okay. But from the inside are actually really struggling to adapt to this new way and make decisions in this remote world in a humane way, which lots of talk about humane leadership at the moment as well. So I'd love to hear the examples.
Yeah, great. Okay. And one thing I would say is I want to be compassionate about how difficult it is to be a leader in challenging times like this. So we can talk about it quite kind of academically and conceptually, but as you say, I'm out there as a practitioner, same as you, and the employees in your organization dealing every day with the humans that are leaders. So any examples that I share with you are done with compassion, for instance. I know that this is super tough. No one said leadership was easy. So I wanted to share two examples of large corporates that I'm working with, financial services and insurance, and the other one, an SME, a kind of fast-growing SME in the pharmaceuticals, health sciences industry, because ironically you'd think that the going would be good for them, but they had a near-death experience, so I wanted to share that. So with the two corporates that I wanted to share with you, it's what have I learned through that I can share with the audience. And I would say that the first organization that I think are doing a really phenomenal job, it's this concept of servant leadership, you would say network leadership with some of the SHL models that you're using, but also this concept of distributed leadership and humility, where the COO that I'm working with, we just got out of a period of intense time with the employees who are struggling, really struggling, because they're going through major corporate change at the same time as the pandemic. And I think there are lots of companies that are facing that. And what do I think that they've done right? The COO has said to me very recently that the people data that we were able to share with him has accelerated his understanding and the team's capability by about 1.5 to 2 years. Basically, if I didn't have that data, we would have spent a learning curve for 1.5 to 2 years trying to figure some of these things out, but the data has helped us to come together. Productive conflict, didn't shy away from the tough conversations, got all of the really, really deep-seated messages out on the table. And you have to have amazing psychological safety. You have to build that to allow people to share the really tough stuff. Peer coaching. So we had an opportunity where we had leaders struggling, sharing with each other what they were struggling with, showing that vulnerability that we're all really reading a lot about, but this was happening in practice, and then coaching each other. Especially with their profiles in front of each other and saying, well, I'm better at this. This is actually a natural strength for me. This is what I can do to help you make it a learned strength, because right now it just so happens that my natural strength is one that you need to demonstrate, maybe not in 6 to 12 months time. We can lean on other strengths you have, but I'm happy to support and coach you now. So that's an example of a really good, humble leader who's in the trenches with his staff trying to help out. Contrast that with another leader who conceptually talks about the importance of the people factor. And it's something I call the no-do gap. It's one thing knowing the importance of the people side. It's a fundamentally different thing to be practicing it every day. And the amount of times that people say, yeah, I know that. And my immediate response is, you might know it, but I can tell you your actions are belying your words.
Yeah.
And this is an example of that leader, where I know that he genuinely means it, However, when I look at the actions that he's undertaking, he's becoming more management, less leadership, gets sidetracked by the latest crisis with finance, the latest crisis with finance. There's always something else that gets in the way of him actually doing the people side. It's seen as one of many competing priorities. And as a result, he hasn't built a leadership cadre, succession planning, hiding great people around him. And we know great leaders are only as good as the teams around them and the talent around them. So if you're underinvesting in those things all the time, there will eventually be a price to be paid. And this is where you get caught with your pants down, right? Because at the end of the day, leadership is shown when you're under tremendous pressure. If you didn't invest all those years in being ready for a VUCA environment, in upgrading your digital technologies, your systems, your platforms, but also your skills and your capabilities, and you didn't invest in having a fantastic team and a brilliant pipeline, now is where it's going to become exceptionally obvious. So it's horrible to have to watch that from the outside. There are things that we can do to try and help. But I also say to some of the people that are trying to impress upon this leader that he's underinvesting in the people side, that, you know, it's a bit like I'm an alcoholic. You have to first admit it. And it's only when someone can see that for themselves you can help. You know, otherwise you're banging your head against a brick wall. So we have to wait until, unfortunately, he learns the hard way about the importance and the value of the people side. That's when we can go in and help more, and we can accelerate. So that's an example of in the corporate side. From a small medium enterprise side, I think it's absolutely fascinating. A very small company I'm working with, about 10 employees, and the funding that they're experiencing in terms of they're in the kind of life sciences, pharmaceutical space. Imagine the amount of money that is now going into that industry. So it's awash with money, and got deep pockets in that space. However, their traditional revenues have started to dry up. This is a very visionary leader, and I am so impressed with how quickly they've been able to pivot. They've reinvented their business model, but they did it together as a small company. It wasn't the managing directors carrying all this weight and thinking, I've got to have all the answers. We spent time together looking at the business 360. We've upskilled the team, so they now have new skills. Previously, it was a lot about invention. There was money coming in the door. They had time and space to invent. They have completely switched into sales skills. How do we sustain our existing clients? How do we grow new business? Much, much more tactical, quarterly OKRs, objectives and key results. You know, the kind of thing that they absolutely hate doing under normal circumstances, but they've seen the value of making, as you said, that pivot earlier. And I'm so proud of the emotional journey that every individual has been through. They've stepped up when they've been put under pressure, and that's not guaranteed. So I'm definitely seeing winners and losers out there. But one thing I would say, though, is that this concept that COVID is like a magnifying glass on a trend of factors that were important before and are going to become exponentially more important afterwards. Things like growth mindset, good old Stephen Covey's circle of concern, circle of influence. You know, all of these things really, really matter right now, and they're very, very useful tools. I think the final thing I'd probably say is that my observations about those that are handling it well and those that are starting to struggle is it's not about what they're doing. You know, we're seeing some brilliant things like parent-child rooms in large corporations to help working parents cope, which we'd never have seen before. It's not what they're doing, it's how they're going about it. It's the rhythms they're getting into with their teams. It's this switch to distributed leadership. So yes, leadership is important, but all of these millions of amazing employees that are stepping up because the leaders have actually stepped back, removed hurdles and let them do their thing. That for me, I think, is what's important. It's not the what, it's the how and it's the why that I would offer as a kind of parting comment.
I think that's right, and it's interesting. You know, as you talk about the leadership team, and as you know, work, the way work's done changes, and it's about those teams that come together to do a task and then maybe go off to do other stuff. That kind of leadership example you gave there with the pharmaceutical company is equally applicable to a small team that's on a project. You know, it's not that different in terms of having to get the team working together to be a great performing team. And the other thing that's interesting that you said really was about data, and how data can accelerate, and that data on people, or what we call people insight, can really accelerate those decisions within an organization. And certainly something I'm passionate about is using that data in a way to be able to drive better decisions and ultimately better outcomes, is the way that, most leading organizations are starting to think about. And that data, having that scientific insights that goes along some of the other data points as well.
Yeah, I mean, I must admit that having switched to remote working about a year before COVID came along, um, I'm in the luxurious position at the moment that I can almost pick and choose who I get to work with. And one thing I'm noticing is that I've got less patience to try and convince somebody about the importance of using data. I'll shift towards positive energy. If I've got a C-level executive who's saying, "Oh, I love 360s," or tell me more about how I can deploy personality assessments and motivation theory and science to help me inform my business decisions. Where am I going to spend my time? I'm going to spend it with the person who gets how powerful data can help steer their business in the same way any other data can help you steer your business, but in the part that is notoriously the hardest, not the soft bits, the harder bit, which is the people factor, which now has become exponentially more important. So use data to help inform your decisions, and it can be fun. It doesn't have to be dry. It can be super fun if you facilitate it in the right way, to use data to help people come together, to understand each other more. And of course, very, very rewarding when people say this has accelerated my business, by an exponential amount. Yeah.
Exactly. Fundamentally, it's about the people. It's the people that drive the business. So I guess a final question. When you look forward, we've come out of a crisis, a pandemic. Things are changing. When you look forward from leadership teams, people, talent management, is it exciting or is it daunting?
Oh, it's always exciting. I've never ever been bored in this space. It reminds me of a presentation I gave to a room full of COOs. And one of them was trying to be a little bit smart, and they were saying, "Oh, Sonia, I think, we're about to go into an economic downturn. So we don't want to talk about hiring. We want to talk about outplacement." And I said, "I'm sorry to have to say, but I believe you're wrong. And this is why. Because the recruitment function, the people function, is busy whatever stage of the economic life cycle we're at. Because you imagine you're a super talented person that's just been put out of a job. Because we're in an economic downturn. You apply to a company with a brand name like the one that I'm working for, and you don't get a response. You don't even get an acknowledgement. Then that's not only going to impact the view that you're going to have of that company as an employer, it's going to impact your view of them as a client. And so if we don't treat people with respect at every stage of the life cycle, so I'm not busier when it's an economic high or an economic low. I'm busy all the time if you really care about the people experience, because people are your clients as well as your employees, so treat them well at all points in time.
Totally. As ever, Sonia, I could talk for hours with you on this stuff. I really appreciate the time. Some fantastic insight. Thank you very much.